If retirement was just about money, it would be easy, or at least it would be easier. Today, we'll go beyond the math problem of retirement. We'll talk about the life problems of retirement, about the parts of retirement that your spreadsheet simply can't see.
Welcome to Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors, where we believe Benjamin Franklin's advice that an investment in knowledge pays the best interest, both in finances and in your life. Every episode teaches you personal finance and long-term investing in simple terms. Now, here's your host, Jesse Kramer.
Welcome to Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors, episode 136. I'm Jesse Kramer. By day, I work at a fiduciary wealth management firm helping clients nationwide. You can learn more at bestinterest.blog/work. The link is in the show notes. By night, I write the Best Interest blog and I host this podcast. I also put out a weekly email newsletter, and all of those projects help busy professionals and retirees avoid mistakes and grow their wealth by simplifying their investing, taxes, and retirement planning. Today is a little bit of a rewind episode. I'm speaking to you right now from early March. It's March 3rd as I speak into this microphone, but I know that this episode is going to come out in early April, and I know that between now and then, my wife and I are welcoming our second child into this world. So to make my life just a little less hectic over the coming weeks, I made the executive decision to replay an old episode, a very popular old episode. This is going back more than 2.5 years ago to episode 62, when I sat down with Fritz Gilbert from the Retirement Manifesto blog, and Fritz is also the author of the book Keys to a Successful Retirement. And before we replay that awesome episode, here's a quick review of the week, a new review of the week from Doug GB. Doug said, "Excellent product, 5 stars. I've listened to most of the podcasts and appreciate the factual and balanced approach taken. I find them very informative and thought-provoking. Thanks for sharing your insights." Well, Doug, thank you for the kind words. I'd be happy to send you a super soft podcast t-shirt. So please drop me an email to jesse@bestinterest.blog so I can get that t-shirt sent out to you. And with that, everybody, on with the show. Thank you for listening and enjoy the episode. I saw a headline recently stating most people don't understand life expectancy data, which means they don't understand the fundamental aspect of retirement planning. How long will you live? After all, a 20-year retirement is drastically different than a 30-year retirement. So let's answer that question right here and now. How long will you live? So first, we can look at the data as of 2020. The average American male born in 2020 will live for 74.5 years. And the average American female, the number is 80.2 years. So let's round those for the sake of ease. Men live for 75 years, women live for 80 years. But there's more to this question today than just that plain data. Because let's imagine you're 55 years old, and let's say you are planning your retirement. How long should you plan for? Well, we can go back and think to those numbers before, 75 for men, 80 for women. So if you're 55 today, then men should plan for a 20-year retirement. Women should plan for a 25-year retirement. Maybe you want to add a few years on there as a buffer, because after all, if those are the averages, half of people live longer than average. So maybe you add 5 or 10 years of buffer, and that's how you get to your retirement timeline. But that's actually not quite the right approach. Now, I like the buffer aspect of it, but if you're 55 today and you think that the average 55-year-old lives to 75, that is not the right way to interpret this data, and it's important. So the average death ages, 75 and 80, we said, they account for all deaths at all ages, including all of the unfortunate deaths that can occur before the age of 55. Once you've hit age 55, you've already avoided all of those premature deaths. You've avoided all the deaths that drag the average down to 75 and 80, meaning that your most likely age of death will actually be above average. You've already avoided the premature deaths before 55. And that fact, that statement that I just made, that's backed up when we look at the Social Security Administration's actuarial data set, and it helps us see this truth in action. The average 55-year-old man today will live another 24 years to age 79. That's 4 years above the average that we talked about for all males. The average 55-year-old woman, she'll live another 28 years to age 83. Again, that's 3 years above the average for all women. So maybe you haven't planned much and now you're sitting down. Let's say you happen to be listening to this podcast. You're sitting down at age 65 to figure out your retirement. 65-year-old men have on average another 17 years of life left, and women another 20. They'll live to 82 years old and 85 years old, respectively. That's huge. Every year matters in retirement planning. The difference between dying at age 74 versus 79 versus 82, that's a really big difference. And as we already talked about before, you might live longer than those averages. So as a really quick example, the average 55-year-old American man has the following, we'll call them death age probabilities. There's a 64% chance that that man will live to at least age 75. If you're 55 years old, you have a 64% chance of living to age 75. What do you think the probability is living to age 80? The answer is 48%. How about to the age of 85? The answer is 30%. And finally, for a 55-year-old man, the odds of living to age 90, that's about 13%. Now, 13% is small, but that's nothing to ignore. That's a 1 in 8 chance. 1 in 8 55-year-old men will live till age 90. So in short, the lesson here is that you can't look at the average life expectancy for all people. Instead, you have to look at the average life expectancy of people your age, and then probably bake in some conservatism on top of that because there's a 50% chance you'll live longer than the average. This is just a simple but vital financial planning tip. And now on the topic of financial planning for retirees, we're going to pivot to a recent listener question sent in by Lawrence. Lawrence wrote, "Dear Jesse, my wife is 70 and I'm about to turn 70, and we've been retired for 8 years. And even with the tough market in 2022, our portfolio is up 40% from when we retired, from about $3 million to $4.2 million. I can't bring myself to spend more. We spend exactly what we want to spend. But now I'm wondering, what if we die with these millions instead of putting them to some sort of good use?" So ask any retiree or any financial planner who works with retirees. They will tell you that most retirees struggle to change from a saver to a spender. They've built decades of strong savings habits. They have years of frugality and budgeting and buy and hold investing. And it's hard to flip that switch overnight from saving to spending. So as a real example, there's a great data set that Michael Kitces published to show retiree savings that actually went up during the 2000s. The 2000s were this famously bad time to be invested in the market. And certainly some people who were invested did see their accounts go down throughout the 2000s. But what this data set shows is that especially for people kind of at the middle to the upper end of wealth brackets, they gained money during the 2000s. They saved more than they ever had saved before. Now, another part of this particular chart that's scary is that the bottom 2 quartiles, or the lower 40% of retirees, have zero assets. They are living exclusively off of Social Security and their pensions. The third quartile, so that's from people from 40% to 60%, they have less than $100,000 in assets. Those 2 stats right there are pretty scary and pretty sad. So a lesson that I take away from this that I hope to impart on you guys is to save early, save often, and to stay the course. We have to go back. Why is it the case that, at least for the top 40% of people in this study, their portfolios grew during some of the worst times in market history, and that for the average retiree, portfolios tend to grow in retirement? Well, the reason is actually pretty simple. It's because most of the time, standard retirees and retirement planners are vastly over saving. They're saving too much and they're spending too little. For example, we can take a look at the 4% rule. The 4% rule was created to avoid retirement failure. Running out of money is retirement failure, and that, we can all agree, is a pretty bad thing. But here's an absolutely crazy stat. The 4% rule, over the course of historical back tests, has been shown to more likely quintuple or 5x someone's retirement portfolio than to deplete it by $1. That's just crazy. The average retiree using the 4% rule, if they retire with $1 million, they're more likely to die with $5 million than they are to die with less than $1 million. That 4% rule, and I've said it here on the podcast before, it is outrageously over-conservative about 90% of the time. It just so happens that in like 2% of the time, the 4% rule has actually been shown to be too aggressive, which that's a whole other different conversation about why the 4% rule is a a coarse tool, but certainly not a fine tool. But anyway, let's get back to today's topic. The required conservatism to avoid retirement failure, that is vital in about 5% of test cases. If you saved less, so if you use, say, a 5% rule where you retire with 20 times your annual spending needs, instead of the 4% rule where you retire with 25 times your spending needs, you are more likely to fail. You're more likely to fail if you use the 5% rule instead of the 4% rule. So for better or worse, retirement planners' first rule of thumb is the 4% rule. And what we're talking about here today with Lawrence, with his question, Lawrence, who's now lived off of retirement funds for 8 years, and he's seen his nest egg grow from 3 million to 4.2 million. He's an example of that over-conservatism. But he's the example of someone who maybe could or should have been using the 5% rule or the 6% rule instead of the 4% rule. Or at the very least, Lawrence could have retired a few years earlier and used the 4% rule to great success. But now, as we sit here, 8 years into Lawrence's retirement, it's too late for that. It's time that Lawrence can't get back. Let's pause that little diatribe for now and really go to address the meat of Lawrence's excellent question. What if he dies with these millions of dollars instead of putting them to good use? Now, first and foremost, Lawrence should go work with a fiduciary, CFP financial planner, and an estate attorney. Lawrence should discuss his options and his preferences for this money while he's alive, but then also after he passes away. Questions like, how do you want your assets to positively change the world? Who in your life is most important to you, and do you want to leave some of your assets to? Are there any charities that you want to leave assets to in some way, or a bequest to your university, to your alma mater, and to leave a scholarship to future young, bright minds? These are the types of questions to ask and then answer. The next point I would make to Lawrence is to not let society force you into spending your money on yourself. If you derive joy from helping others, I'm sure there are terrific philanthropic uses for your money while you live. The next one, Lawrence, if you have children or grandchildren, remember Warren Buffett's thoughts. Leave them enough money so that they feel they could do anything, but not so much that they could do nothing. In other words, if you leave your kids, say, $500,000 each, that's enough money that they could do a lot of interesting things with it. But that's not enough money so they could sit around for the rest of their life and do nothing. Leave them enough money so that they would feel they could do anything, but not so much that they could do nothing. And the next one is something I call running the McDonald's tests on your favorite things. So the McDonald's test, real quickly, as a quick aside, it comes from a story of a client who I'm actually working with at work, where one of his favorite things to do is literally to go eat burgers and fries. It's like his favorite meal. We were talking about it one time, and this gentleman is a multimillionaire. So I asked him, I said, oh, cool. Are there any great burger and fry restaurants that you've been to recently? And his answer was, no, not really. I like McDonald's. My response to this gentleman was, well, that's totally fine. If you like McDonald's, if you like the flavor, if it's convenient for you, I'm not going to talk you out of it, but you're sitting on a couple $1 million. So if you want to, you could take a road trip to any burger and fry restaurant in upstate New York and spend an afternoon, spend a weekend getting there, and go have a terrific 5-star burger and fry meal. And maybe that would actually be more enjoyable to you than McDonald's. So this gentleman thought about it. We ran the numbers and I showed him how it was totally within his financial plan to do so. And it ended up being a terrific recommendation for him. He really enjoys the fact that now he takes these road trips on a regular basis to go eat burgers and fries all over upstate New York. I call that running the McDonald's test, where you take something in your life that you really enjoy and you ask yourself, do I have the financial means to actually pursue this passion even more than I already am? To Lawrence, who asked today's question, to Lawrence, who is worried about dying with millions of dollars, run the McDonald's test on your favorite things in life. Trust me. One of the principal duties of financial professionals, albeit a subjective and hard to measure duty, is to imbue confidence in their clients to spend money. It's called cash flow planning. When you do cash flow planning for a client, you're telling them that they should be confident in a certain amount of income, But for retirees, it's really a certain amount of expenses that they'll be making throughout their retirement. You should spend money. You should enjoy the fruit of your labors. You should trust the math. You should trust your portfolio and enjoy your life. Now, if you do that and you still have lots of money left over, you need to determine while you're alive and while you're mentally spry, you need to determine what you want to do with that leftover money. So Lawrence, work with a CFP, work with a estate attorney, and enjoy these golden years of your life. Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. I love getting your questions, and some of you ask me questions about the wealth management firm I work for in Rochester, New York. Others ask about the Best Interest blog and this podcast, Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors, which operate without advertising, without pushy sales, and with no paywalls. How can the blog and podcast stay afloat without me dumping my own money into it? Well, to answer both those questions, I want to point you to episode 78 of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. I intentionally recorded episode 78 to shine light on those topics and inform you how you are actually helping and can continue helping these projects carry forward. So if you've ever been curious about the business of my blog and podcast, or if you're curious about my day job in wealth management, please check out episode 78 and let me know what you think. All right, so now let's throw it over to a really fun conversation with a really fun guy, Fritz Gilbert, who I mentioned before. Fritz Gilbert is the creator and author of the Retirement Manifesto, widely considered one of the best retirement blogs on the internet and winner of numerous awards and accolades. Fritz also wrote the book Keys to a Successful Retirement, which is a top-selling financial book on Amazon. I really enjoy Fritz's ability to cover both the hard financial topics, but also the soft lifestyle topics for his retiree readers. And I'm really excited to share his fun viewpoints here today on the Best Interest podcast. Fritz, I was listening to you on a recent Morningstar podcast, excellent podcast. We will throw a link in the show notes for everybody. But Fritz, you mentioned a statistic that had to do with how pre-retirees tend to focus on financial matters, but that post-retirees end up thinking a lot more about lifestyle matters in retirement. So I'm just curious, how did you first learn about that? And when you first learned about it, how did you react? And then what exactly are the main issues that you think that post-retirees really are thinking about?
Yeah, wow. What a great lead-off question, Jesse. First of all, happy to be on your show. I love your content and I really enjoy being on. But it's interesting. You know, I've gone through the retirement transition. I've been retired 5 years now. I've been writing for 8. So I started writing 3 years before I retired. And at the time, like everybody else, I was very much focused on the financials. And if you read the first year of my posts, almost every one of them were financially related, right? It's what you're focused on. In your working years, you're just, when can I retire? Don't obsess on when you can retire. Enjoy the journey as well. You know, that's my biggest caution to the FIRE community, which I was a member of. I'd say I was 55 when I retired. So I was kind of late FIRE, but still FIRE. And the one concern I have with that lifestyle is you can get so obsessed on when can you achieve FIRE that you forget to enjoy the present. So that's just a word of recommendation or advice, I guess, to the younger folks that are on the journey. But regardless, you're focused on the financials. You have to be, because you know you're not going to be able to retire until you get the financials in order. And you're looking at the retirement calculators and you're trying to figure out the 4% safe withdrawal rate and all that kind of stuff. That's natural. And what I say is that's necessary, but it's not sufficient. So when did I first discover that reality that you have to focus on the non-financial as well? And I would say that was probably about a year or two before I retired. I'd been writing for about a year, paying a lot of attention to the topic, doing a lot of research, writing a post every week. The more I read from people who had traveled the journey before me, I started seeing more and more about the importance of the non-financial stuff. And I'm like, yeah, okay. You know, it takes a while to be convinced. But I listened to the stuff I was reading and I applied it, and I started writing posts about the non-financial side. You know, we moved to a cabin up in the mountains, so we had a pretty major lifestyle change. And we started thinking about it quite a bit. About a year before I retired, we really knew, okay, we're good to retire. June of 2018, you know, this was like in 17. Okay, June of 18, we're out. We know we're good. But I still had a year to go. So rather than just continue to refine the numbers, they're kind of what they are at that point. Yeah, you're still investing. You're looking at returns. You're trying to build up your cash, you know, for the transition. But essentially, it doesn't get you a lot more benefit to continue to grind on the numbers. So I spent that last year starting to really focus on the non-financial stuff, which we can talk about. But what it really hit home is as I went through my retirement transition, it was incredibly smooth. And I started reading more and more research about the highest correlation they found for people that have a successful transition to retirement. It's a huge transition. Don't underestimate how big of a change it really is. And a lot of people struggle with it. But the research has shown that the people that have the most successful transition are those that have spent the most amount of time planning, and not just planning on the financial stuff, but they've recognized the need to focus on this non-financial area. So that's what my book's all about. It's the, keys to a successful retirement. And it really focuses on the things you should think about as you're preparing for retirement that will help you have a better transition. It's a hugely important topic, and it's not something most people realize. And eventually you will, right? If you don't think about it at all, you hit retirement, you'll go through what I like to call it. Eric Weigel came up with the term, or he used it in his book, the messy middle. You will have a rocky transition. It's not uncommon. And that's what that article in the Morningstar podcast was about, these blind spots that we discovered.
Right.
And a lot of people struggle with that transition. And most of the reason that they struggle is because they didn't realize the importance of this non-financial stuff. You figure it out in time, but it's a lot easier if you think about it on the front end.
Yeah. You just mentioned a term there, Fritz, blind spots, that I want to come back to and see if there are any specific blind spots that you and Eric have found. It's an interesting concept because I'm 33, so I've got some time ahead of me. But I think of it as, you know what? I know what a weekend feels like. Transitioning into a weekend isn't a big deal. I've taken some even 2-week vacations before. Maybe a little planning goes in there, but really transitioning to a vacation, then transitioning back to work, not that big of a deal. So it's like, what would the big deal with retirement be? All it is, it's a transition into free time. I don't see what the big deal is. I've done it before, but obviously there's more to it, right?
Yeah. And how do you summarize it? I talk about how it's kind of like marriage or having a kid or, some of these major transitions in life. You can't really appreciate it until you've actually gone through it. And I was obsessively curious about what it was going to be like. I really was. Now I'm retired 5 years. And I guess the biggest thing I would say is nothing at all like a vacation. And the reason is because it never ends. Vacations, you're always thinking about going back to work. It's a little break, so you're really enjoying it. You're savoring every minute because, you've been looking forward to this for 6 months and you booked your flights, 6 months ago and blah, blah, blah. But retirement is day after day after day after day after day after year. It's years and years of this. Mm-hmm. And initially, yeah, it's like a vacation. And there's that honeymoon period where it's just euphoria. You don't have the alarm clock. You're ecstatic. I never have to go back to work. This is amazing. And that's really a nice period. And almost everybody experiences that. But when the reality sets in is after you've been retired, it varies for most people. I'd say 6 to 18 months is pretty much the norm. And you start realizing this is my life now. You start losing appreciation for the freedom. Losing's probably too strong a word, but you start recognizing that there's more to life than just being free. And you have to find those things that really keep you motivated and feel good about yourself and productive. And a lot of those things you get from work that you don't realize you're getting from work, you start missing and you start realizing how important they are in your life. And that's when that quest to kind of fill in these non-financial areas really becomes important, because it's those areas that really turn it into a really enjoyable phase of life. I'm loving retirement, best years of my life, but it's because I've been very diligent in the way I approached it, and all the research I've done since, probably by accident as much as anything, but the things I've focused on have turned out to be pretty important things to help with the transition.
Fritz, I was telling you before we recorded that I've listened to maybe 6 or 8 podcasts that you've been on in my last week, podcasts that you've been on over the last couple of years. And for what it's worth, it sounds like you love retirement. Your joy comes across in your voice on every podcast. But I think it's important to emphasize that what you had just said is that it didn't come without work. It didn't come without preparation. You had to sit down and think about it, prepare. And maybe now we can transition back into some of the blind spots that many retirees have going into retirement. Blind spots that it sounds like, for the most part, you thankfully prepared around and they weren't blind to you. But what are some of these common blind spots that can affect retirees? Yeah,
and probably a little bit of context would be of value, I guess, to the listener. Eric approached me. He's another blogger, and he's an author. He's written a book, and he's more of a financial coach, I guess, for retirees. And he said, hey, I'd like to do a survey. You've got a big audience. Can we reach out to your audience and do a survey? And what his goal was to get a population of pre-retirees and a population of retirees, post-retirees, Ask them the same questions and compare the results. I was like, I love that, Eric. What a great concept. And let's see where they differ, So there's a whole article about it. There's actually like a 50-page study that you can link to on my blog. If you just look up blind spots on my blog, you'll find it. You can put a link in the show notes.
Will do. Yeah, we will link that.
Yeah, but the two biggest takeaways, if I think about it now without looking at the study, but just what's stuck in my mind now, several months after we've completed the work. The first one is the reality that a lot more people struggle with the transition than they think they will. If you ask pre-retirees, I'm rounding the numbers. I don't know the exact ones. I could look them up. Doesn't matter. Roughly 25-30% of pre-retirees think, it's going to be a pretty major transition, whatever. But let's say 70% are like, it's going to be a piece of cake, or, I'm not worried about it. Compare that to the people that have gone through the transition, and over 50% of them say, boy, that was a tough transition. So, and that goes to my earlier point, recognize how big this transition really is and prepare for it, because that's one of the things that people that haven't done it yet tend to underestimate how big of a change it'll be in your life. The second one I would say that sticks in my mind, and this goes to the non-financial benefits that you receive from work. People don't tend to recognize this. You think about your paycheck. My paycheck's going to be over. I've got to be financially independent. Absolutely true. But there are also probably 5 or 6 non-financial benefits that you get from work that most people don't really think about. One is obviously you got your relationships at work. Even when you're working from home, you're still on Zoom calls. You have a relationship. You're texting your coworkers. You're involved with other people every day. Common interests. You're working on the same projects. Whatever. You've got a sense of purpose. You've got objectives from your boss. You've got deliverables. You get achievements. You nail a presentation. You feel good about it. You get some feedback. Maybe it's rewarding. You have a sense of identity. What do you do, right? Everybody asks, I'm a X, right? You relate to what your job is as your sense of identity. It's those types of things. The biggest blind spot that surfaced in the study was not too many people that were still working expected that they'd miss their coworkers. Maybe, again, 20-30%. But if you look at the people that actually retired, almost 60% actually missed those relationships. And as much as you think, we'll keep in touch, the reality of it is you really don't. You might have 1 or 2 particularly close people that you keep in touch with a little bit, but everybody says, we'll keep in touch, and nobody does, right? It's just a reality. So the importance of building relationships with people outside of your workplace that will continue post-retirement is probably one of the biggest lessons that I took away from the study.
The social aspect, the identity aspect, the positive feedback aspect, but that is loneliness in retirement is kind of what you just touched on there, that we get these friendships, these social bonds at work that oftentimes disappear in retirement. And transitioning from loneliness, there's actually some interesting data when it comes to depression in retirement, which I found surprising. What is that data?
Yeah, and this is kind of surprising. I wrote about this when I was getting ready for the transition. I think I've written 3 posts about depression in retirement. My most recent one was a couple weeks ago, and it was why 28% of retirees are depressed. And it focused on some studies that were done that really tried to quantify it. And 28% is a pretty legitimate number, which is high. If you look at somebody asked me, how's that compared to the population as a norm? I was like, geez, I missed that one. I should have put it in the post. So I did some Google searches. It looks like it's about maybe 10%. So 10% of the general population are depressed. 28% of retirees are depressed. That's a huge number, right? One of the biggest factors, which is kind of outside of your control, is those that are forced into retirement earlier than they planned tend to have the highest rate of depression. So, okay, what are you going to do about that? You could argue it. But the takeaway to me, and I put this in the article I published today about why 72% of retirees are happy, right? In that study in that article, I included a study that showed 56% of people are forced into retirement earlier than they planned. Huge number. So you're naive if you think I can work till I'm 65, I'll be fine, I don't have to worry about it. 56% of people don't get to the date that they wanted to get to. So the takeaway from that is be prepared earlier than you have to be, just in case. And if you still love your job and you want to keep working for a while, that's fine. But to be dependent on your job and suddenly lose it can be a real trigger into depression in retirement. The other thing that I found, an article I published today, was the 9 traits that the happiest retirees tend to have in common that aren't as common among the depressed retirees. And those are things like we're talking about now. A lot of them are focused. There were 3 that were financial. And from the top of my head, it was having at least $500,000 in assets, having your house paid off, and having multiple sources of income. Okay, those are, we've talked about those, but to me, the more important ones were the 6 non-financials. And they were actually shown in some studies to have a higher correlation to retirement happiness than your economic situation. So again, it goes back to the importance of these non-financial ones. And the characteristics of the happy retirees were a sense of curiosity. They're really willing to try new things. They are exploring a sense of purpose. A lot of reference to Wes Moss's work, which he's done a lot of work on happiness and retirement. And, the difference between happy retirees have an average of 3.6 core pursuits and depressed retirees have like 1.9, right? So it's double the number of things that you found that keep you engaged. Friendships, relationships, we talked about that. The happiest retirees have close to 4 close friends. The unhappier ones have less than 2. So, it's really good research, and it helps people that are planning for retirement think about what are the drivers that I need to be working towards in addition to the financial elements to maximize my chances of falling into the happy camp, as I call it.
Fritz, let me just take a step back because I'm thinking to myself, and I'm thinking of some of our younger listeners. When you were saying earlier that a lot of times it was 56% of retirees actually were forced to retire earlier than they desired to. What are some of those forcing functions? Is it a mean boss who pushes them out, or is it something else?
Well, there's I would say 3 main things. One is, downsizing. People go through downsizings at work, and that happens, unfortunately. So that's a percentage. That's kind of the one you'd think of immediately. But the other 2 are a bit more surprising. And one is, and they're both kind of related. They're health related. One is either you've got a parent that you need to take care of that is taking more time than you can afford, so you have to quit to take care of a spouse or a parent. The other one is personal health. You get into a health situation and you're no longer able to work. So those 3 probably account for 80-90% of the reasons. Unfortunately, the downsizing one is a risk to everybody. You could argue the health one is somewhat inside your control. I know you focus on exercise. I focus on exercise. Do what you can do. And the reality is most of us, as you get into your later working years, have parents that are getting older, and a certain percentage of parents require a lot of care. And, some kids my wife, she was a stay-at-home mom, fortunately, but she ended up giving full-time care to her mom. We were lucky that we were in a position to be able to do it. Some people aren't so fortunate. So yeah, those are probably the biggest factors. And again, let me address your earlier, you started talking about younger listeners. And one thing I would encourage younger listeners to do on the whole topic of retirement is focus on maximizing your savings rate, automating everything. And every year that you get a raise, let's say you get a 3% raise, increase your savings 2%, in your 401k or in outside mutual funds, whatever, but schedule that so that it's automated and it happens on the same date that you get that increase in pay. So what happens? Okay, you get 1% more in your take home pay. You feel like you got a little bit of a bump, feels pretty good, but you just increased your savings rate by 2%. So if you do that year over year and force those savings and live on the rest, minimize debt, obviously how you prioritize your money, pay off your debt, build your emergency fund. Those are all good pieces of advice. But the biggest thing is find a way to gradually over time, increase your savings rate every year and just don't worry about it. Track your net worth once a year. That's all I did and it was fine. Track your net worth. Don't obsess on this stuff. Enjoy life as you live it and just give it time because, you got anybody can retire in 15 years. Mr. Money Mustache got a great article on that, depending on your savings rate. But that's 15 years, right? That's a long time, even for a more aggressive saver. Don't spend your whole life in your late 20s, early 30s through your 40s thinking about retirement. Enjoy it now. Enjoy your family. Enjoy your kids. Take nice vacations every year. Use all your vacation time, right? That was one of my big things I was working. So many people burn vacation days. Don't do that. They give them to you for a reason. They don't care. Take them. It's self-imposed if you feel like you can't take your vacation. So take it and enjoy life and save as much as you can save. Find a way to increase it and, wake up in your late 40s and start looking at the numbers.
I like that for a couple of reasons, Fritz. One reason why is I'm slowly making that transition personally from if I look at myself 5 years ago where I was, looking at my spreadsheets or looking at my budget multiple times a week, tracking, paying attention and tweaking savings rates, rerunning spreadsheets to see if I could increase it here or there. It did get a little obsessive. It got a little tiring. And in the long run, did it give me any benefit? Not really.
Yeah.
There's nothing I can do. There's nothing you can do about what the stock market is doing. All we can do is choose to whether we buy on a monthly basis or not. I mean, that's all the decision making we have in our power. But the choice to increase your savings rate every time you get a raise, that's a phenomenal choice. It's well within your power, but it only comes up once a year. So there's no need to obsess over it. Personally, I do end of the month. I'll just look at my budget, make sure everything's good. We're good to go. But if someone said quarterly, a couple times a year, once a year, whatever, that's fine.
Yeah.
As long as it's somewhere in the background and you realize that at some future date, you're going to kind of sit down and put in some work.
Yeah. And then, in fairness, I think probably most of the people that listen to your content, listen to, read blogs, et cetera, they pay attention to this stuff. The caveat I would say is if you don't pay attention to this stuff and you've got a big debt problem and you can't get out, and you're spending more than you make year on year, month on month, you're just digging yourself deeper. Those aren't the people we're talking to, right? These are people that are responsible, that are working their way through the journey and they're saving and they're being responsible. Those are the people that don't get caught up in the obsession about it. It's easy to do. I did it myself at times. And I learned, to your point, other than keeping an eye on your asset allocation, you think of a bear market. A bear market at your age, best thing that could possibly happen. You want the Dow to fall 90%. You want it to crater, right? It would be death to me, but it would be nirvana for you. You want a bear market, right? So you got to get your head out of thinking about, my net worth growing. No, you just want to buy, continue to buy every month. I had a couple of bear markets later in my career, and I doubled down. I said, you know what? I can take 4 months and just jack it to my savings because I know the market's really down right now, right? You've got to counterintuitive against that fear. A bear market is a great thing. A big long-term rally is not really what you want right now. You want to buy cheap and give it 30 years until you need it. So
totally. I was trying to preach that to all the 24-year-olds out there who in 2019 were so excited that their 2-year investment track had such positive returns. And it's good that they got enthusiastic for investing. It's good that they could see that a simple investing strategy into index funds was yielding these big returns for them. But it was also important to point out, A, this is pretty abnormal. 20% a year for 4 years in a row is pretty abnormal. And then B, if you actually zoomed out to the time you retired, this wouldn't be what you wanted in terms of when you were buying.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. I send a free weekly email to thousands of readers that shares 2 simple things, just 2. The first are my new articles and podcasts, so you'll never miss when I publish new content. And the second is my favorite financial content from other corners of the internet, so you can see what's been helping me the most.
But Jesse, I don't want another email.
I hear you. I make this newsletter short, sweet, and full of essential information, and readers enjoy that. About 85% of newsletter subscribers are engaging with the newsletter more than once a month. They're enjoying it, and you will too. You can subscribe for free on the homepage at bestinterest.blog, and you'll get a free PDF of my white paper titled The Step-by-Step Guide to Building Your Retirement Paycheck. That's right, a free weekly email that thousands of people like you are already reading, a free white paper to help you plan for retirement, and you can sign up for free at bestinterest.blog.
But it's interesting, Fritz. So you're a big DIYer.
Yeah.
I was and still am a really big DIYer, so much so that now I'm kind of doing some of this work professionally and helping people who don't want to be DIYers do some of their financial planning work. But I understand that at least once, kind of as you were gliding into retirement, and it might have been more than once, you did sit down with a CFP simply to double check some of your numbers, some of your thought process. So I'm just wondering, what was that process like for you in terms of the decision to sit down with a CFP and just get everything double checked? And then actually logistically, what was it like, to have that help?
I have been a DIYer my whole life. And I've always been I call it a passionate hobbyist in this stuff. I back when they had real magazines, I used to read Money Magazine and Kiplinger's and all the print magazines. I mean, I've studied this stuff for decades now. So I was knowledgeable about it and I just enjoyed it as a hobby. And that was fine, for the first, I started 22 and I retired at 55. So 33 years. And for, the first 30 years, that was fine. It was sufficient. My reason for reaching out to a CFP as I got close to finalizing my decision on when to retire was, let's be humble and let's not assume we know everything. CFPs and professionals that do this for a living, they see hundreds, if not thousands of clients. They have a process. They go through it with a different set of perspectives than you and I possibly can. There's value in that, right? And having somebody look over what you've done, and I should say, earlier in my career, we had a thing with Vanguard, a 401k, and you could do a once a year checkup with a CFP. So I did that a couple times, and they were always like, "Yep, you're on track. You're doing well. Asset allocation looks good. Savings rate looks good. The basic stuff was good." But my concern was the transition from accumulation and building your wealth through the career into positioning yourself for the withdrawal of those assets in retirement, which is something obviously I'd never done before. So it wasn't an area that I had experience. It wasn't an area that I'd gotten feedback from Vanguard that I was in good shape. And I felt like having a guy that walked many people through this transition is worth the effort. So the process was good. They have, I think all of them kind of have the same process. You send them all your assets, you send them your spending estimates. They work through they always have kind of a little presentation they do at the end that shows if you're on track or whatnot. And my biggest thing was, am I missing anything? I knew I could retire at 54 or 55, and I was leaning towards 54, but I also kind of had in the back of my mind, I wouldn't mind doing one more year just to kind of pad everything. I'm a conservative guy. I always estimate a little high on my expenses and estimate a little low on my returns. I always try to get some padding in there. So having a professional look at it and say, you know what, you can make it out by 54 if you want. You'd be able to do that. I still decided to go to 55. But having a professional that kind of looked over everything and could talk to me about some of the things that maybe I hadn't thought about, turns out I hadn't really missed much. I mean, I was pretty on track, but having a third party verify that is money well spent.
I recently saw just a really quick social media post from a gentleman named Peter Lazaroff, who's a kind of young up and coming, I think he's a CFA. So he's more on the investing side than maybe the planning side. But one of the things he said is like just this kind of hidden value in doing what you did is what he called objectivity. And the fact is, Fritz, you're so into your own personal situation, as you should be, as we all hopefully should be. But sometimes it is nice to have a third party come in with fresh eyes, with no sort of personal relationship to you, and just say, hey, I'm an objective third party here. Here's what I see. And maybe it's a little different than what you see.
Yeah. And I think the other value you can get, and not so much from a one-off, but why in my mind it justifies paying somebody to help you on your financial planning, is really more on the behavioral psychology side of it. If you panic in a down market, if you have total stress as market volatility, which is a reality, there's always market volatility. I was always like, hey, the market's down. Great. I'm going to increase my investments, right? I never worried about that, but human nature is to worry about it. And the worst thing you can do is sell after a downturn, right? And then you got to figure out when you're going to get back in, and you lose the upturn, and it's suicide. And having a professional guide you through those market downturns, if they make you really uncomfortable, can save you a ton of money over the long term, because that's when you'll get slaughtered. If you make a big mistake in your asset allocation due to market volatility, that's probably the biggest individual mistake people can make. And a professional will typically help you avoid making those kind of mistakes.
Exactly. Another quote that I recently heard is that behavioral finance is the last frontier in terms of, if you look at the various services that a good financial planner will provide a client, like financial planning has been solved, right? Like we know what the tax code is. We know how spreadsheets work. There might be some complicated math involved, but there's nothing new happening there. Yeah. Portfolio management, diversification. We all know the studies on active versus passive management and why sometimes, why a certain stock or bond allocation makes sense. That math has been solved. But behavioral finance is something that, as far as we can tell, human brains will remain irrational for from now to the end of time.
Exactly.
And there will always be a need for an objective, calm professional to step in and say, hey, now's not the time to panic.
Yeah. And I guess the last thing I would think about on this side, one of the things that brought value to me doing this, I guess just a confirmation that we were ready, was for my spouse, right? She knew I was doing this stuff, and she kind of pays the bills and I do the longer term stuff. It works well. But, she trusts me and she's like, yeah, it's good. But, getting confirmation from an expert brings confidence to those that aren't really managing it day to day as well. So there's, you got to think about the relationship and the whole household, not just you as an individual if you're managing your investments.
Totally. And that happens to me once in a while too. It happens to us. A DIYer will come to us and they say, if I get hit by a bus tomorrow, just so you know, I've informed my spouse to come talk to you. So, here are my numbers. Here's my plan. Here's what I've done. Sometimes they want to sign on and work with us. Sometimes they just say, like, as an FYI, if I get hit by a bus, you're going to get that next phone call. And it's important to have that backup plan in place. So let's talk about that glide into retirement one more time. I love this quote from your book, Fritz. You encourage your readers to make a decision early in the process that you're going to approach retirement with optimism, curiosity, and gratitude. Real quick, can we dive into those three words, optimism, curiosity, and gratitude? I know you've already mentioned curiosity a couple times in this episode so far.
Yeah, and really this came from 3 months before I retired. I wrote the 10 Commandments of Retirement. It's actually hanging on my wall back there. And they were really kind of my guiding principles on how I wanted to live life in retirement. And the interesting thing is as I thought through it and wrote the post and wrote the 10 Commandments and look at it even now, 5 years later, the interesting thing to me is how many of those are mindset related. And really having a positive mindset going into this, it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy, like many things in life, right? And the good thing is, all those three things you just mentioned, those are all mindset related items. And the mindset is something that, for the most part, we have control over, right? We can choose to be negative, or we can choose the glass is half empty, the glass is half full. It's your choice. And making a decision that you're going to look at things from the optimistic and not Pollyanna, unrealistic, but just choose to look for the good in life can go a long way, right? So that was kind of the basis for that quote. And then the specific things about curiosity, you've got to fill your time with things that bring you purpose and how are you going to find those, right? You're suddenly 100% responsible for it. You've always had somebody telling you since you were 4 or 5 years old. You've always had somebody telling you what to do and how to fill your day. Suddenly you're responsible for it. And the best way to do that is to listen to your curiosity, pursue things that interest you, take the first step. And I've got just a myriad of examples of people that have done that. And you just start. My blog is one. I just started writing a blog just out of curiosity. And it's turned into a major purpose in my retirement. That purpose now is bringing fulfillment and reward and recognition and sense of purpose and all those things we talk about. But it all started with pursuing curiosity. The other thing I would say about gratitude, recognize if you're able to retire earlier than average, you're a very blessed person, right? I mean, how can you not be thankful for that? And what I've found is as you make that transition from your working years to what am I going to do with my time, finding a way to take that time to help other people and be gracious that you're in a position where you don't need anybody else's help. But guess what? Now you're free. You can help other people. So we started a charity, my wife and I, and Freedom for Fido. We build fences for free for low-income families that have dogs on chains. And the reward of not only being outside with a group of volunteers doing the physical labor and having that sense of community of like-minded volunteers, but more importantly, seeing the help that you can inject in a community is rewarding beyond words. Again, that comes from the mindset and pursuing things and seeing where they lead.
That's awesome, Fritz. That's awesome. You might know this by now, but my wife and I, we foster dogs. So we're big dog people.
I saw that in your email. Yeah, I was going to mention that. Yeah, that's awesome. We're both dog guys. So yeah, that's cool.
Well, Fritz, this has been excellent. And I'd love to put a stamp on this. Last question for you. And it's very much in line with what we've been talking about, but my typical listener is probably in that 25 to 40 range, but that means that their parents are in that 50 to 70 range. So if you had one quick tip to give to a child of a pre-retiree, and then a second quick tip to give to a child of a post-retiree, what would those tips be?
Ooh, I've done hundreds of podcasts and I've never had that question. That's a very good question. The first thing that came to my mind when you said that is when I talked about depressed versus happy retirees, the chances of depression are 4 times higher if you're divorced than if you're married. Now, if you get remarried one time, the odds are the same. You're okay. But if you're divorced, the odds go up. What changes the odds for a divorced person is how strong their social network is. And as a child, you are a key piece of that social network for your parents. So number one, support them, be encouraging, show an interest, ask them what they're going to be doing, share a podcast with them. Say, hey, I just listened to this guy, you might be interested in him, share resources, help them find, they're struggling with the journey, whether they tell you about it or not. Everybody's anxious about retirement. So try to find a way to have that discussion with them. And the other thing is, I'm thinking now more people that are into retirement, encourage whatever they're discovering and whatever they're, experimenting with, encourage them to continue to pursue their dreams and live a great life. The other thing at some point as they start getting older, make sure you have the discussion with them about legacy and estate planning and things like that. A lot of kids don't. I had it with my dad before he passed, and it was very helpful because I heard directly from him what his wishes were. And after he passed, having his input on what, he would like us to do with the estate and things like that gives you freedom after the fact to, like, we built a warehouse. We bought 4 acres next to our property and we bought a big barn. But I did that because I know my dad was saying, look, I know you're financially set. If you receive any money from me, you might not, right? We might spend it all. Who knows? But if you get any money from me, I want you to spend it. I want you to do it for something that brings good purpose in your life. And hearing his voice in the back of my head, even after he was gone, was really helpful, to help encourage you that that's an okay thing to do. That's what he would have liked. So have that discussion with them about their wishes for you, after they're gone at some point. So yeah, stay engaged with them. If you've had arguments with them and you've kind of got a distraught relationship, get over it. Once they're gone, you're going to regret it if you don't. Mm-hmm. So, bury the hatchet, find a way to make amends, take them out to a nice dinner and say, look, I know we've had some rough patches, but you know what? I really want to reestablish our relationship together. Because to a parent, there aren't too many things in life that matter more than your kids. And based on my experience, I've been a child and I've been a father. Parents probably love their kids more than the kids realize. So give your parents a break and make the first step in reestablishing a rapport if it's, gotten weak, and make the effort to call them every week. Take the time. Yeah, I know it's a hassle. It's Sunday. I'm off work. I don't want to talk to mom and dad. Talk to mom and dad. Take the time to call them. After you listen to this podcast, call mom and dad and just touch base with them. It's worth it.
I love that answer, Fritz. On a couple of the estate planning things, listeners, you can go back to episode 55. The title was Conversations with Aging Parents. It was all about that kind of topic. But I really like that, Fritz, where, most of those tips, most of those conversations had to do with the non-financial side of retirement. And that really is such an important thing. So Fritz Gilbert of the Retirement Manifesto, thank you for coming on the Best Interest Podcast.
Hey, Jesse, I really appreciate it. Love your show and love what you're doing. And I'm really honored to be on it. I appreciate it very much.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. If you have a question for Jesse to answer on a future episode, send him an email over at his blog, The Best Interest. His email address is jesse@bestinterest.blog. Again, that's jesse@bestinterest.blog. Did you enjoy the show? Subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever you listen. This helps others find the show and invest in knowledge themselves. And we really appreciate it. We'll catch you on the next episode of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors is a personal podcast meant for education and entertainment. It should not be taken as financial advice, and it's not prescriptive of your financial situation.